You're the one who makes me come running. You're the sun who makes me shine. When you're around, I'm always laughing. I wanna make you mine. I close my eyes and see you before me. Think I would die if you were to ignore me. A fool could see just how much I adore you. I get down on my knees, I'll do anything for you. I don't want anybody else. When I think about you, I should probably stop right there. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this is the inaugural episode for a second season of the New Movie Diary, a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. A very happy Women's History Month to all of you out there, and a very special Women's Film History Month for all of my fellow film buffs. I'm personally doing my best to devote this month of March to only watching movies directed by women, including new releases, with this past weekend happily coinciding with one of my most anticipated films for the first quarter of the year, finally branching out in its limited theatrical release following its debut on March 8th. I am, of course, referring to Love Lies Bleeding, a sophomore feature for English writer-director Rose Glass. This film is co-written by Glass and fellow London-based filmmaker Weronika Tulfiska, and following Glass's very promising debut back in 2019 with the psychological horror film Saint Maud, Love Lies Bleeding sees the director continuing to develop a body of work that, in some sense, is very much typical of a kind of movie that rides a middle-brow line between lurid genre cinema and a more stylized art house film, what has sometimes been begrudgingly lumped under the elevated horror or elevated genre flick banner over the last decade or so. Now, Love Lies Bleeding is, of course, not a horror film. It's a period romantic thriller set in New Mexico at the turn of the 90s, starring Kristen Stewart as a gym manager and Caddy O'Brien as a transient bodybuilder whose seemingly instantaneous, passionate attraction to each other ends up spiraling downwards into a chasm of steroid addiction, organized crime, and murder. But there's an extent to which one could say, and again, this isn't exactly atypical of how Glass's generational cohort tends to approach that mixing of genre and art house film conventions, but there is an extent to which that despite the fact that Love Lies Bleeding is a crime film, Glass still writes and directs it somewhat like a psychological horror film. This is the most obvious in terms of Glass's substituting of more blatant exposition about the backstory of the characters, more especially Stewart's character, Lou, the gym manager, with abstract, surrealistic montages. Not that the background narrative of Love Lies Bleeding is particularly convoluted. To her credit, Glass attempts to tell as much of this story in a dynamic, visual way as possible, but even as far as everything we aren't explicitly shown, Glass tends to favor these stark psychological impressions to anything else. So, the backdrop of the character drama will be that Lou is the manager of this gym, which is actually just one of several front operations controlled by her crime lord father, Lou Sr., played ably by the reliable Ed Harris, who primarily deals in the trafficking of illegal firearms across the Mexican border. But the way Glass will tend to portray this is through the insertion of shots often rendered in dark red monochrome, where the emphasis is less on the content of the image or even upon contextualizing it in terms of the plot, and is more suggestive of the almost diabolical power that Lou's father wields over her and over the setting, even as she attempts as much as possible to estrange herself from her father. You also see this tendency towards treating this crime thriller like a horror film in terms of Glass's treatment of Katie O'Brien's transient bodybuilder character, Jackie, and as she becomes increasingly addicted to steroids that Lou provides for her. Instead of merely depicting Jackie becoming increasingly manic or violent, Glass will render the effect the steroids are having upon her and the violent tendencies of her psychological state in the form of discrete shots of her body and her muscles protruding and bulging unnaturally, almost like she's literally hulking out. And besides its body horror elements, this motif also builds over the course of the film to a point where at the climax, we even move past the treatment of this crime thriller like a psychological horror film and right into the terrain of this crime thriller being treated like an outright fantasy with magical elements. And when that full evolution happens is fully where I expect most of the polarization of Love Lies Bleeding to take place. But if you're also paying attention to and vibing with the building black comic undercurrents of the film, Glass and Tolfiska's sometimes disturbingly gallows sense of humor, I hope as many of you out there will feel the same sense of farcical, campy elation with how the story ends as I did. I think there's a good payoff of dark comedic relief after all of the dark stuff that we go through over the course of the film. And yet, even more so beyond that, there will be little things that Glass does that I very much appreciated in keeping with that idea of taking a crime thriller subject and making the horrific and the semi-surreal and disturbing a more motivating force in how she structures and shoots a scene. In particular, there's this really enigmatic moment in the film where Lou is in a hospital room after her sister Beth, played by Gina Malone, always a delight to see her, and honestly, her performance, Gina Malone's, for what is rather a small, marginal part she has, it might be the most exciting in the whole film. She has like this really kind of diabolical turn, at least through Lou's eyes over the course of the film. But anyway, Beth has been hospitalized by her abusive husband, JJ, played by Dave Franco, who's also disgustingly good in this movie. And Lou is basically mourning at her bedside, and as Glass is simply focused on this semi-profile close-up of Kristen Stewart as Lou, without even doing anything to announce his entrance into the scene, Ed Harris just slides or almost slithers into the shot beside her. And Glass's construction of the shot is so cryptic that for a second, you're wondering if this is even literally supposed to be happening, if Ed Harris's character is even actually supposed to be there, or if he isn't just some phantom of Lou's mind literally imposing itself from the background, from her subconscious. Especially as a follow-up to Saint Maud, which is more explicitly a psychological horror film, it's very compelling to see the development of Glass's vision in that way, that she not only adopts the postmodern affect of a lot of younger filmmakers these days of blending the spectatorship of conventional genre cinema and art house techniques, but specifically this tension of taking one type of genre film but treating it like another type of genre film, so that Love Lies Bleeding becomes this very dynamic and, even when it's not as effective as it could be, at least an excitingly messy blend of crime thriller and psychological horror and black comedy, and of course, I think above all, the most successful aspect of the film as an erotic film. And just as an aside before I continue, there of course needs to be credit paid to Ben Fordsman, this film's cinematographer with whom Glass previously collaborated on Saint Maud, as well as, again, in terms of genre blending and period style, not necessarily the most original visual treatment in the world, but certainly exceptional of a type of elevated genre film cinematography, making excellent use of high contrasty digital videography, the use of artificial noise to emulate the graininess of film, some very striking and motivated uses of more eye-popping colors in set and costume design in contrast to a broadly somewhat muted and sometimes, again, even monochromatic palette. For a film that is intending to be very sensual, the cinematography doesn't simply look good in a adequate sense that conforms to contemporary trends in cinematography. The film itself is very sensuous and exciting to look at. And as long as we're on the topic of Ben Fordsman, coincidentally, he also served as a cinematographer on one of this year's earlier releases that I quite liked, Andrew Cummings' Out of Darkness, that made it stateside back in February. I highly recommend checking that one out, especially for Fordsman's cinematography. Anyway, continuing where I left off, as a follow-up to Saint Maud, Love Lies Bleeding doesn't just see Glass continuing to develop her unique application of the blending of genre filming and art house techniques. It doesn't just see her continuing to develop her blending of different genres of film. It also brings to life her continued juxtaposition of the erotic and the grotesque, something that I found far more enamoring in Saint Maud than anything having to do with either that riding of the line between exploitation and art house cinema. Again, something that I find rather typical of this era and at times rather tiresome in terms of its tendency of a lot of young upstart filmmakers in not simply picking a lane and perfecting their craft within it, as opposed to dividing their creative intuitions and delivering a debut that falls rather short of the pleasures enabled by either art house or genre films. I found myself far less enamored with either that or, and this isn't entirely unrelated to the previous point, but I found myself far less enamored with either that or the character work in Saint Maud, which, again, as with a lot of filmmakers in Glass's generational cohort, it leans heavily on this sort of heightened portrayal of what is, in essence, a psychological narrative, but where the actual psychological content just ends up coming off as a strained or even glib means to an end rather than an earnest exploration of psychological pathology and how it affects perception or how it relates to the sorts of extreme behavior that might make for a compelling thriller or a horror movie. In the case of Saint Maud, I found both of those qualities of the film took a very firm backseat to what was, on the other hand, this incredibly assured collision by Glass, as I said, of the erotic and the grotesque, where there's an extent to which one finds themselves becoming very aroused by parts of the story that Glass is telling in Saint Maud, which involves a lot of voyeurism and masochism and yearning and sexual projection, especially for a filmmaker making her debut with a psychological horror film. Glass did a very good job of not just getting under the spectator's skin in terms of the tension of the story, the build up to the sort of violent explosion and reckoning we know is coming, but in getting under our skin by really successfully rendering these incredibly sexually potent scenes where, I hope I'm not revealing too much or being inappropriate by saying, I certainly found myself being a little turned on by. And one might say, well, yes, but that's just basic subversion, Ian. Glass titillates and arouses us so that she can subvert our voyeuristic spectatorship with something more revolting or shocking. But I think that is ultimately drastically selling her work, first in Saint Maud and now especially in Love Lies Bleeding. I think that's drastically selling her work short in a very severe way. Look, I had not even seen Saint Maud until I watched it in preparation for seeing Love Lies Bleeding, and all you really needed to do to get my ass in the seat to see Love Lies Bleeding was show me Kristen Stewart and tell me she's going to be in a lesbian crime film opposite Caddy O'Brien. Like, thanks, all I needed to know, sign me up. But when I did watch Saint Maud, I now had like 1,000 more reasons to be excited in lots of ways to see Love Lies Bleeding, because now I had seen Glass's previous work, and I was just absolutely stunned by how she was colliding themes and images of the erotic and the grotesque. But it was not subversive, per se. Saint Maud is an incredibly erotic film. It is also an incredibly grotesque film. But the way in which it excites you and gets under your skin is not about setting you up for expectation of one kind of voyeuristic satisfaction and release and substituting another. It's by fully mixing those sensations together in a way that is still feel very thrillingly uncomfortable, and yet somehow no less viscerally exciting, in such a way that takes the erotic and the grotesque and sort of subliminally unpackages the contradictions of both, rejects the binary in the construction of each, and jolts you with this completely new, indefinable emotion where you feel like not only your mind but your very body is being opened up to the erotic in the grotesque, and also the grotesque in the erotic. And so, again, I was already, I don't mind telling you, incredibly hot and bothered, some might say absolutely soaked, to see Love Lies Bleeding. I already love Kristen Stewart as both an actor and a style icon, and look, let's face it, everybody, just one of the most attractive people who has ever lived. I had not been familiar with Caddy O'Brien before seeing those trailers, but after even in those nuggets from the publicity, seeing how Glass and Fordsman's camera absolutely lavished O'Brien with Stewart's longing feminine gaze, I'm just trying to keep my cards out on the table here, folks. I love women who are yoked. I love that Glass seems to love them as much as I do, or at least is able to do such a good job of getting into the head of a woman who is absolutely as thirsty for Jackie as Lou is immediately upon seeing her in the movie. And by that point, I'm already thoroughly in this incredibly slippery position where I'm like, oh God, okay, I really like Kristen Stewart in this situation, but I'd also love to be Kristen Stewart in this situation, but maybe I'd also like to be O'Brien in this situation. I haven't even seen the movie yet, and Glass has already got my psychosexual identity getting knocked back and forth like a shuttlecock. She's playing badminton with my noggin here. I realize I'm coming off extremely perverted right now, so I just want to say it here. I am absolutely unequivocally a pervert for this kind of thing specifically. I know that I'm a straight man here. I am not at all trying to over-appropriate or objectify the work of a queer woman artist, but I simply can't even begin to approach reviewing Love Lies Bleeding without just being honest and laying it all out on the table and owning up to the fact that I know that Glass didn't make this erotic lesbian crime movie with my perversions in mind. All I'm saying is that she may as well have, and I mean this as the highest compliment to her as an artist who not only doesn't seem to be afraid of being a little perverse with it, but quite frankly seems to elevate that kind of perversion to a creative mastery, to a degree that Glass might have made one of the most erotic films that mainstream adult audiences have had access to in literally decades. As far as I'm concerned, Glass has handed down the fire of the gods to us. She is Saint Pervert in this regard. Love Lies Bleeding is mainly going to be categorized as either a revenge thriller or a crime thriller or a romantic thriller, but I think above all, the most accurate way of describing it is as an erotic thriller. This is not a movie that is romantic in the sense that I understand it, at least, where if there is sex in a romantic movie, sex is always framed as something that exists in this kind of Cartesian divide between the mind and the body, where the body is merely this visceral vessel of the mind, and the mind is the more important organ of judgment and developing real attachment to a person. And part of what makes Glass's work with Love Lies Bleeding so powerfully erotic is that she very strikingly does not divide or compartmentalize her characters in that way. And this is perhaps something you could argue is already more common in queer cinema anyway. But part of what's so compelling about Lou and Jackie's relationship as it develops in the film is that it is so fully visceral and bodily. And even if in terms of the plot, the rational mind kind of takes a backseat right from the jump when Lou is just out of pocket offering this woman she just met steroids, Glass's direction is so magnetic because the body isn't just a vessel in her romantic or erotic vision, right down to those horrific shots of Jackie hulking out because of both her steroid abuse and because of her profound devotion to Lou. The mind and the body are so intimately connected in terms of just articulating who a person is, and then therefore how attraction occurs and builds to this violent fever pitch. There isn't this Cartesian divide. It seems like Glass is far more in tune artistically with the idea that, no, these characters are both minds and bodies. The body affects the mind affects the body. You can't just separate them in terms of really relatably telling this story. Just like with Saint Maud, there are elements of Love Lies Bleeding that feel a little cliche, and when you really start thinking about it, the script itself, right down to the dialogue, feels almost overly perfunctory. But just as with Saint Maud, and I think to an explosively superior degree in terms of Glass's development of her craft, the way that she manifests the erotic on the screen is so undeniably effective that it kind of compels you to forgive the messy bits just so you can appreciate a filmmaker who isn't trying to patronize or condescend to you with another kind of hyper-distilled, archetypal genre fairy tale romance, where the point is, no, this is not an epic love story set against an interchangeable generic backdrop. This is fundamentally an erotic adventure. This isn't just about appealing to your mind, it's about relating to your body as well as your mind in this fully captivated way. This is about an art that respects the untapped corporeal needs of the spectator. And don't get it twisted, as with Saint Maud, there are many messy parts of Love Lies Bleeding. There are many violent and grim parts of Love Lies Bleeding. There are many outright gross aspects of Love Lies Bleeding. But again, I think the key to Glass's developing brilliance as a filmmaker is that she is not being subversive. The messiness, the violence, the grimness, the grotesquerie, it is not there to disappoint or subvert erotic expectations. It is to facilitate the yearning for them and to make the erotic payoff and relief that much stronger. What makes Love Lies Bleeding such a powerful work of erotic art is that it understands that grotesquerie doesn't subvert the erotic, or at least it doesn't have to. And in uniquely, intuitively brilliant and qualified hands like Glass's, it shouldn't subvert them. Grotesquerie should, rather, put us just as much in touch with not just what mentally, rationally disgusts us, but with what deeply, viscerally, bodily affects us, revolts us in a way where revulsion and shock brings our senses alive. And thus, in those terms, the grotesquerie pursued facilitates our feeling the full spectrum of sensual experience. Rather than subverting or contradicting the erotic, grotesquerie enhances the erotic by its interplay. I think it's clear enough that I was a big fan of Love Lies Bleeding, easily for me one of this year's early semi-masterpieces, and one that I'm probably going to be clinging on to as a personal favorite for the rest of the year. I'm giving it a 4.5 out of 5. Again, incredibly impressive sophomore work by Rose Glass, and even if you don't appreciate it as much as I did, it's still a very good film, and we should all be excited to see what Rose Glass does next in her career. With that, I'm gonna call it right there. Sorry for the wait, and if you're wondering where the hell a video was for my top films of last year, I'm terribly sorry. I swear I'm working on it, but until then, please like, share, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time. Oh, and happy belated St. Patty's Day. Woo! Yeah, I'm so elegant.